All right, guys, I am finally getting these videos out to you again. I'm so sorry it took so long, but just so you know, there's a lot that went into these. Um, it's a long theory, first of all. Like I told you before, it's going to be probably 3 videos, maybe 4. Just depends on how I end up chopping it up. I'm just starting to record this, so I don't know what it will end up being. Chances are the videos will not be uniform in length. So the first one might be an hour and the second one might only be a half hour. I'm not sure. I had to take almost 500 screenshots to get through all of this. And I also just found out that I'm going to be moving. So it's happening pretty quickly in the next like month. So I also wanted to say that over the next 4 weeks after I get these videos out, I will get them out over the next few days. I'm going to try to get the first one out on Friday, and then it just depends on how long it takes me to finish the editing, but probably over the next 3 to 5 days after that, I'll get them all out to you. Okay, so you will have the series to watch. After that, over the next few weeks, I'm going to be moving, so I'm probably going to be online less. I'm going to still try to get one video a week out, even if it's just answering a few questions, a few asks. But if I cannot do that and I'm gone for a week or two, then just know that I will be back as soon as the move has finished. Okay. On top of that, I actually did this one time, recorded it one time, this first hour, and it didn't work. So I had to do it again. This is my second try. Hopefully, second time's the charm. So again, just all to say, I have been trying to get this out to you. I have not forgotten, but things have been a little hairy lately. So here's the thing. I'm going to go through this, and basically the way that I've laid it out is I'm going to go through everything that happened first, and I'll explain what I mean by that in just a minute. And then after that, kind of near the end, I'm going to do more of a general analysis of what I think it means. So I am going to be telling you to pay attention to things throughout, and then I'll come back to them. I know that sounds a little bit, maybe clunky, but if I get sidetracked and go off on a total um, tangent about something, I'm never going to get through everything. Okay. And we have a lot to get through here. So just bear with me. Okay. So let's just go ahead and dive in here. I'm going to try to get through the first episode, everything that happens in the first episode in this first video, and just even that's going to be long. The first one is by far the thing that we need to go over the most heavily, that has the most stuff in it. And then a lot of the other episodes, I'm just jumping through and picking out what's relevant. So anyway, okay. So I actually learned this during season 8, watching season 8 of The Walking Dead. What I learned is that it is possible to watch the show and understand what is, well, to know what's happening on screen, as in, we're not actually confused, but still not completely understand what's happening in the situation. And I think that's because the way that the writers present it is very piecemeal. So they jump from character to character, they often stagger the timeline. And you really have to actively step back and look at things from a bird's eye view in order to get the whole picture. And I noticed that during All Out War because half of the recaps I was doing during season 8, which was All Out War, I was just telling people what was actually going on and what the motivations behind the scenes were and for each character and saying, okay, so while this group is doing this, Rick and Daryl are doing this. And it's like, I had so many people who were thanking me for doing that because they were watching the episodes but couldn't figure out what was going on. And I think we have something a little bit similar to that going on during Operation Lead the Walkers Away. It's not nearly as bad. It's not nearly as confusing as All Out War was, but it's still there. Okay. It jumps back and forth between past and present. And then we've got different groups of characters doing different things. And so, because it's going back and forth and jumping all over like that, it's hard to get a linear sense of the story and what's going on. So, first, like I said, I'm going to lay out what happens in a linear way. So, remember that in episode 1 here, there's flashbacks that are in black and white, and they go back and forth between the present, which is colored, and the past, which is black and white. I'm going to lay it out starting with the earliest flashback that's black and white, go through all the black and white flashbacks, and then into the present so that you can actually see the linear chronology of the story. And that's going to be really important because, I guarantee that the writers do this not necessarily to confuse us, but because it makes it harder to pick out patterns this way. Okay, it makes it harder for us to see the symbolism and the way it all connects. So this is their way of making sure that it's still mysterious, right? So the other thing that's important to know as we get into Operation Lead the Walkers Away is that this whole story is not in the comic books, okay? This is something that Gimple just put together. I looked it up, and there's something kind of similar. It's a storyline where they lead walkers into a quarry and trap them there. So that's kind of the opposite of what happens here. In here, the walkers are coming out of the quarry at the beginning. But even that, that might have been a jumping off point for this arc, but even that arc in the comic book is very small. I don't think it takes up hardly any narrative space. Whereas here in the show, this arc actually lasted for 9 episodes. Okay, it goes from 601, which is this one, here's not here, to 609 when Daryl sets the lake on fire and they all kill the walkers that get into Alexandria. Um, and of course, during this arc, Deanna also dies, which leaves Rick in charge of Alexandria for reals, as Eugene would say. So remember that when The Walking Dead was on regular TV before streaming was a thing, um, it would have 8 episodes at a time, right? It was always broken into the first half of the season and the second half of the season. They were 8 episodes each, 16 total. Well, this arc does not stop at episode 8. And that was actually pretty true of most of the Walking Dead arcs. They didn't make it that neat and tidy. Like 8 episodes was one thing, and then eight episodes was another. Very often the arcs, would overlap. So, I think they did that to keep us on our toes, and also it made it easier to do like a cliffhangery thing at the mid-season finale. But the point is that this episode clearly does not wrap up until the first episode of the second half of the season, which is 609. And that's another reason that it's hard to remember what happened and pick out patterns and make things connect, because when we're watching episode 9, it's hard to remember what happened in episode 1 when you're watching week to week. And that wouldn't even been a 9-week difference. It would have been the 8 weeks for the first half of the season. And then there was like a 3-month waiting period before the second half of the season came on again. It would end like end of October and not come back until February. So we're talking months, unless you had just rewatched the whole first part before the next episode came on, which, a lot of us did, but not everyone, then you're going to have a really hard time remembering what you're supposed to be connecting. And even if you remember what happened in a general sort of way, it's still the details are getting lost, right? Okay, so just something to remember, and that's why I'm doing this and showing it to you in a linear way so it's a little bit easier to follow. Okay, so let's get started. Right at the front, at the beginning, the earliest flashbacks, we're seeing a lot of reunions. Remember that at the end of, the second half of season 5, Tara was hit in the head when something exploded. It was the episode where Noah died, right? And she's been in a coma ever since then, which actually does make her a bit of a Beth proxy. But the last episode of season 5, she woke up, and all we saw was her waking up. We didn't see anything else. So this is picking up right where that left off. And we're seeing people that are coming in and looking amazed because she's awake, and they're so happy that she's awake. So we've got reunions between her and Rosita, and then Glenn and Nicholas return. Remember that they were on the outside and Nicholas tried to kill Glenn. And so Maggie gets there and he says, "I'm okay. What happened?" Then Eugene comes in. Again, he's just very excited that Tara is awake. And then she says something kind of sad here. She says, "Somebody tell Noah to come in and protect me," because she doesn't realize that he died. So that's what's going on there. We have reunions. We have some new romances. This is not the best picture, but it's Carl and Enid, and they're just kind of touching hands. And I believe this is Ron here in the background. So we've got a little jealousy going on. He's seeing that they're getting close. We have Morgan and Rick. So again, these are reunions. This is Morgan and Rick's reunion. Once again, at the end of season 5, they really only had a chance to stare at each other. We didn't really see much of them interacting. So here we have the Rabbit's Foot and Morgan's Ouroboros book here. But the reason that the map really jumps out at me is because very recently in Daryl Dixon season 3, we have seen Caudron return, and he saw Laurent's Rubik's Cube. And I said this when that was on, that this feels very much the same as this map that Morgan used to find Rick. So in both cases, we said Caudron is Morgan, but it's also a matter of them having this object that they use to find someone they're looking for. So I do think that's going to be the case with Caudron in the series. He's going to find Daryl and Carol. And just keep in mind that if we're seeing the same thing more than once in different templates, it's important, okay? But again, we see Rick and Daryl, Rick and, Daryl's there too, and Morgan talking about things. They've just gotten back. And then we see more romance here with Abraham and Sasha. Now, at the time that this aired, we didn't actually know this was going to be a romance, but we have a lot of hints toward it. I'm also going to tell you that Abraham and Sasha are very much a Beth and Daryl proxy. So we have alcohol. This is that Danville stuff that we also see around Denise's death. He has a wedding ring, and he actually took this off Pete. Or maybe it wasn't Pete, maybe it was Reg. He took it off one of the two that died, and he's just kind of messing around with it. He puts it on top of the bottle, it falls off, so then he puts it on there again and it stays. But the point is, this is a huge hint toward the romance because it's a wedding ring, and we see Abraham with it, and just in a minute we're going to see Sasha walk up, and so it's clear that it's like meant to be a romance between the two of them. And then we have the whiskey, which alcohol again making them a Bethel proxy. Now here he just it's kind of funny because he gives her the peace sign, she gives it back. There's an awkwardness between them, and it almost feels a little bit more platonic at first, like a bro sort of thing. But obviously, we all know that eventually it turns into a romance. Okay. Now, the next set of flashbacks that are black and white that we see is Daryl fixing his bike, right? Rick comes out of the house and he says, first, Daryl says, he all right with it? Is he okay with it? And Rick answers that it was pretty much his idea. And then Daryl comes back with, Rick says he gets it. And then Daryl says, it's a bed and a bath, but still a cage, you know. And Rick again says he gets it. So when we're watching the show, you're not exactly sure what they're talking about here. Like there's no context for it right away. But eventually it becomes clear that they're talking about Morgan. And I will show you this as we go along. But just to tell you what's going on here, the community has decided to keep Morgan apart from the rest of the people in Alexandria and have him live in the brownstones by himself. So he's not allowed to come out or move around the community without permission. And this is because he's a stranger. And of course, Rick can vouch for him, but even Rick hasn't seen him in a really long time. So they're just being cautious until they know they can trust him. And this is what they're talking about. So if you watch that again, Daryl's saying, is he all right with it? Is he okay with it? And Rick says he gets it, meaning Morgan gets it. And then he says it's a bed and a bath, but it's still a cage. We're basically keeping him in a cage. And Daryl says, Rick says he gets it again. The biggest thing I want you to take away from this is that he gets it line. He says it twice, and obviously that's a parallel to Beth's I get it. And combined with the next scene, the next set of flashbacks I'm going to show you, they actually define what this means for us. And I have never realized that before. So this is kind of a big deal, not to mention a parallel to Beth. Okay. So this is also where Rick and Daryl talk about, Daryl tells him about the wolf trap. And I mean, he doesn't tell him a lot about it right here, but Rick says that Morgan told him about it. And Rick says, we don't need to keep looking for people, but then Daryl doesn't like that. He says, do you feel different about it? So this is just what they're talking about. So then the next set of flashbacks, Rick goes to see Morgan and he's doing his Aikido. Rick apologizes to Morgan saying he's sorry they have to do this. He's sorry they have to keep him in the cage for right now. And Morgan says, it's all right. The way I look at it, sometimes you're safer when there's no way out. This was such a revelation to me. I had to sit and think about it for a while, okay? There's literally no way we would have been able to understand what he meant by this when we were first watching the episode. Why? Because we hadn't seen Here's Not Here yet. So this is another example of non-linear storytelling. There's a lot of things in this episode and also episode 2, where Morgan says things that call back to Eastman, but we don't see that backstory for him until episode 4. Episode 4 is Here's Not Here, that shows the Morgan Eastman backstory. So there's literally no way for us to understand the context from which Morgan is pulling this wisdom because we haven't seen his backstory yet. So you really do have to watch it more than once to really make it all fit and get it, right? Now, this obviously does harken back to something he learned from Eastman, and what it immediately reminded me of is there's a moment in Here's Not Here when Eastman tells Morgan that his cell is not actually locked. So Eastman is keeping Morgan in an actual jail cell with a lock on it because, Morgan is in his angry seeing red stage and he keeps trying to kill Eastman. But at some point, Eastman says the door is not actually locked. And so Morgan comes out, sure enough, it's not locked, and he attacks Eastman. But he can't defeat him. Eastman's bigger and just in a calmer state of mind than Morgan, so he bests him several times. But Eastman also refuses to kill Morgan, and he kind of starts hitting Morgan with these really difficult psychological truths. And then Morgan, when he can't deal with what Eastman is saying, he actually walks back into the cell and shuts the door. And it's probably the most psychologically fascinating moment of that whole episode, okay? So that, I think that's what Morgan is referencing here, because as we're here in the first episode, the Eastman thing is in Morgan's past. That already happened for him, even though we, the audience, have not seen it yet. Um, but what he's saying is that sometimes when you can't face what's outside, which very often is the emotional and psychological issues, it's easier to pretend like you're trapped, even if you're really not, right? So in terms of this situation, Morgan doesn't mind staying in the cage long enough for Rick and his people to feel safe. He understands the world and that strangers can sometimes be dangerous, right? And he's been through that himself. He didn't want to come out of the cage because he couldn't deal with the psychological issues, you know. And I think this is actually a huge theme in the show. They all get to a point, you know, when bad things happen where um, they lean in to the adrenaline, right? Because it's easier to have something physical to do, to have to fight walkers, to have to say, you know, we have to be violent and we have to fight for this and we have to, you know, take all this extreme action and that sort of thing, right? It's easier to do that than to sit in the quiet and actually deal with your grief over what's happened. And so that's very much what Morgan's saying here. Sometimes it's like you feel safer when there's no way out because you have to focus on getting out and you don't have to focus on your emotions. And it kind of is in line too with living versus surviving. When you're just surviving, you're running, you're fighting, you're leaning into that adrenaline. But when you're living, you actually have to deal with the issues that are not physical and that are not adrenaline based. And that a lot of times feels harder and feels scarier and less safe than actually just going out and fighting a walker. Now, let's take this back to Beth's situation and her I get it in the hallway at Grady. She understood this truth as well, specifically about Dawn. This is something Beth learned while she was at Grady. I think there were times during Crossed and Coda when Beth really thought she was getting through to Dawn. You know, especially that moment when they killed O'Donnell and the whole thing with the gun and the elevator shaft. During that scene, Dawn was crying. She was sobbing and she was exhibiting what looked like genuine emotion. And honestly, in that moment, it probably was genuine for her. I don't think Dawn was faking that. I think Beth had enough of a good influence on her to actually give Dawn a few breakthroughs, right? But at the end of the day, and by the end of the day, I mean in the hallway during the prisoner exchange, Dawn still reverted back to her old ways, which were toxic, okay? She demanded that Noah come back, and then she got really smug about having him back, and that's what pissed Beth off and led to her stabbing Dawn with the scissors, right? So you got to understand that just to kind of take a high level view of this, at the end of the day, even if rape was going on, which we knew it was, and even if Dawn felt she had to allow it to go on, which she said she had to keep her officers happy until they were rescued, at the end of the day, she would rather do that, which is very harmful and very toxic, than face the harsh realities of the outside world in order to create a better life for everyone. Because she would rather be the queen of her own little roost and lord herself over other people rather than giving them a higher quality of life, right? Um, and she says this to Beth in various ways while she's at Grady. You know, she tells Beth, you can't survive alone on your own out there. And of course, Beth pushes back and she says, I am strong. I can survive. Beth just knows better because she's been in Rick's group and she grew up with Herschel. And you know what I mean? She knows better because she's lived better. So she knows that Dawn is full of crap, but I don't know. I think this is her learning it in a very real way, even though, you know, she probably understood that people were like this before. This is the first time her really experiencing it and trying to figure out what to do. And I think what Beth finally realized in the moment when she said, I get it now, is that despite maybe Dawn having a few breakthrough moments, she would still rather stay inside and deal with the problems inside rather than face the reality of outside. I really think that this is what the definition of I get it now means. It's about people who purposely cage themselves, even though they don't really need to be caged, because they're too cowardly to face the harder, darker realities of the world. Um, but by facing those harder, darker realities, they find a better life on the other side. So they go from surviving to living. But Dawn wasn't willing to do that. Now, I know that it sounds a little bit harsh to say that they were cowardly. In some cases, it's not so much cowardice as it is being broken, being wounded. Like, I'm not saying that Morgan was a coward because he wouldn't face what was going on. I mean, you could say that what he was doing in that moment was cowardly, but he was also dealing with some pretty hefty PTSD. So it's about needing to heal, right? And sometimes in this world, they are not given the space to heal, and that just makes everything worse. But if you don't heal, a lot of times you die because you're leaning into toxic behavior, right? So this is just a huge theme. And, we can see it once I realize this, we can see it so many times at Grady. Her telling Noah, "You're not trapped." But we often talk about how Noah, he wasn't really toxic in the sense that he was evil or anything. I mean, obviously, he was not one of the rapists. He was not like Gorman or O'Donnell, but he also didn't leave. He had plenty of time to leave. As soon as Beth decided she was done, they were out of there. And so it's a matter of him staying caged rather than taking on the outside world. And that's such a huge theme here in the whole Walking Dead universe because it's understandable. It is scary to be on your own outside and not knowing if you're going to be able to find food and not knowing if you're going to be able to survive. But that's a big theme of dystopian worlds. Are you going to stay under someone's thumb and live this really toxic lifestyle, or are you just going to go out on your own and figure it out, right? Okay, but again, I'm kind of going um, off on a tangent here. But the point is, I really think that's what Beth meant when she said, "I get it now." That she saw that Dawn was not willing to do the right thing. She would rather stay and be the queen of her own little place, even though that meant people there didn't have as good a life, even though she was allowing rape to go on, all of that, right? And I honestly think the writers put the story together this way, telling it backward and out of sequential order, because they don't necessarily want us to figure stuff like this out. They want it to be something of a mystery. But if you can figure it out and look closely, um, you can figure it out, right? But you also have to like disentangle the story. You have to put it in linear and chronological order and then look at what's being said. Okay, you guys, some of you already know this, but you have to look at the dialogue, okay? And by look at it, I mean absolutely use the closed captioning because a lot of times I don't catch it either unless I'm reading it. Some people can catch it better if they're listening to it auditorially, but just understand that the dialogue is always symbolic of something. Um, that it tends to be vague, and if you really pay attention to it, sometimes it doesn't sound like they are talking directly about what they're actually talking about. So let me just use this scene as a perfect example. If they were being really direct about what they're talking about here, Rick could have come in and said, "Oh, sorry, we have to keep you in a cage. It's just everybody will feel safer if you're here until we know we can trust you." And Morgan would be like, "Oh, it's cool. I get it." And that's all they had to say, but that's not what they do, right? He says, "I'm sorry for this, for having to do this." That could mean anything. He's not referring to the exact situation they're in, right? And the writers do that because it can also be symbolic of something else, right? So they're being vague. Um, the way I look at it, sometimes you're safer when there's no way out. And then he doesn't explain what that means. We are left to try to figure it out ourselves. And we have to look at clues in other stories. I mean, the biggest thing here is to look at Morgan's backstory with Eastman, and then it starts to become a little bit clearer, right? But Rick doesn't say, "Okay, what the crap are you talking about, Morgan?" You know what I mean? They don't explain it. And the writers do that on purpose, right? Now, the next thing you have to understand is that Rick and Morgan are actually a Beth and Daryl proxy. So I know that sounds strange because obviously there's no romance going on between Rick and Morgan, but they represent two people who have been apart for many years and are now coming back together. Okay, in that way, they represent Beth and Daryl, their proxies. The title for this episode actually comes from this same conversation. When apologizing for having to keep Morgan in this other building for a while, Rick says, "We need to get to know each other for the first time again." Um, and this just sounds so Beth and Daryl coded to me. I mean, that's exactly what Beth and Daryl are going to have to do when they come back together, get to know each other again because they haven't seen each other in 10 years, right? But then very quickly, I think they're going to realize that they do still know each other, that at their core, they're who they always were, even if they've changed somewhat. And this is exactly what happens with Rick and Morgan. It doesn't happen quite yet. I'll get to that flashback in a minute. But pretty quickly, we're not given the exact timeline, but I would say it's within a day or two. Rick tells Morgan that he can leave the brownstone building and come to live at the house with them. Basically, he's saying that he understands that Morgan is the same good man he met all those years ago in King County who saved his life. So he trusts him and they don't need to treat each other like strangers again. But guys, I want you to think about this, okay? Literally, the title of this episode means two people who have been separated for years getting to know each other again. Hello, Beth and Daryl, when she comes back, right? Okay, so let's move on to the next flashback. I don't have pictures of it, but we do see the return of Heath. Remember that Eugene meets him at the gate, and it's kind of goofy. He talks about the hair game and all that. And we see this part too where they decide not to bury Pete, Jesse's husband, inside the walls because they don't want to bury, Rick doesn't want to bury killers inside the walls. So in the next flashback, we see Rick and Morgan are going to go outside the walls to bury Pete. And Deanna, this is Deanna's line here. She says to take them out in take his body out in a certain direction. We never go out that way. So it's a perfect place to bury him, basically. And just understand, for the sake of knowing what's going on here in season 6, that it makes sense because they go in a direction that the Alexandrians never go out that way. That's when they hear the walkers at the quarry. She says, let the trees have him. And then Ron follows them out there because he wants to see where his dad is buried. There is a part here too, and this is where we get another really clear indication that Rick is a Beth proxy. He suggests to Morgan that maybe they don't bury Pete, maybe they just leave him. And Morgan rejects that and he says, no, that's not who you are. We need to bury him. And Morgan starts digging, and Rick does that thing where he's just looking stubborn and scowling and like, I'm not going to do what you think I'm going to do kind of a thing. But then he hears the walkers, right? So they leave Pete's body there for a minute and go look at the quarry. And once they see it, Rick reasons that this is the reason Alexandria is still standing, and hasn't had to deal with walkers much because most of the walkers were drawn here and therefore didn't bother the community. Ron shows up and Rick saves him from a walker, and he tells Ron that Ron shouldn't be out there. And Ron says, I don't care what you think. And then Rick says, it's not what I think, it's what I know. This is another Beth line, right? So we have her dialogue here. But it's more than just the dialogue, okay? Once again, you have to really step back and take a bird's eye view of what is happening. Because after this, Ron goes with them. They go back to where Pete is. And without any prompting from Morgan, Rick just starts burying Pete. And Morgan kind of smiles. He's happy that, that Rick is doing this. But it just shows Rick's respect for the dead, the same as Beth had. He's a good person who believes in burying people just as she did. And I will go ahead and say this here. I think a lot of what's said and done by our characters here, specifically by Rick's group, is a reflection of what happened during the missing 17 days. Okay, so maybe in other circumstances, Rick would not have cared all that much about burying Pete. Even if he respects the dead, he just hated Pete, right? So because Pete was his enemy, maybe it really wouldn't have made a difference here. But because they didn't get to bury Beth and everything went wrong, suddenly he's thinking he should try to bury whoever he can bury, even if it's somebody he doesn't like. So we're going to see stuff like that, and I will point it out as we go through, that to me very much reflects whatever happened during those missing 17 days. And the reason they're putting such a fine point on some of these things in this episode is because they're trying to emphasize them and suggest that the same thing, or possibly the opposite thing, happened very recently. And Rick's group is quite sensitive about it because of that. All right. So in the next flashbacks, we see just basically a meeting going on about what they're going to do about these walkers. It's mostly logistics about what they're going to do and why they need to do it. I do notice that Carter, he's standing right over here, he's a voice of opposition through the whole thing. And he says very much in a emphasized way that they can't control that many at once. So, okay, this isn't about if it gives, it's when. And he says this a couple of times. We just can't control that many. And Rick says, yes, we can. I think Rick says, maybe I don't have the whole conversation here. The point is, they really can, right? And we see them do it. It's a little bit messy. Um, but we see people do this over and over again. Now, of course, this is long before the Whisperers, but the point is, I think they're trying to get us to pay attention to the idea that a walker horde can be controlled if you know how. And I'm going to come back to that when I talk about what this means overall. So, yeah, he's here. Rick is just talking about how because they herd up, we can direct the herd, right? And I just want you to notice how confident Rick is about this, right? Um, we didn't see them do this in a big way before this season. We saw them, in the first season, Rick and Glenn put walker guts all over them and moved through a herd. We saw them trying to get the walkers away from the prison fence. We didn't see them leading the walkers away in a big way. They did it a little bit with the piglets, when the walkers were about to collapse that one wall of the prison. Rick and Daryl used the piglets to draw them away, but that was only like a few hundred feet so they could reinforce the wall. They didn't have like this big operation to lead them away. But suddenly, in season 6, not only are they doing this, but Rick is very confident that they can do this, as though he's done it before, but we have never actually seen him do it before. And I think that's important, okay? But again, I will come back to it. Of course, Carter doesn't want to just take his word for it. So during this next part, they are talking about what they're going to do. And this is important for the logistics of the operation, but it's also important symbolically. So let's go through this. The idea is that the walkers, it doesn't really show it here, but the quarry would be somewhere to the right of this picture, right? And they're going to be coming down Reading. And if they continue on Reading, they are going to end up walking straight into Alexandria. So what they want to do is turn them like hard right turn on Marshall Road. And this is what we do see them do. And the idea is that that way the walkers will no longer be heading toward Alexandria. They will be heading parallel and head off that way, right? So that's what they're going to try to do. But they're worried that just using cars will not be enough. See, we're going to force them west here. How? And Eugene suggests they use the big ass metal plates from the construction site to reinforce, like a pool table, 8-ball cornered pocket. We've had a lot of theories in the past about the number 8 and the fact that 8-ball corner pocket usually means victory. Overall, I'm not going to really go through all of that. You guys, and I didn't say this at the beginning, there's a lot of things that I'm skipping over. Okay, I'm really going to be focused on the main arc, which is the operation to lead the walkers away. So I'm skipping over most of the other things. It's not that those other things don't have tons of symbolism in them too, but I'm just trying to focus on this one thing. So I'm not going to go into things like, 8-ball corner pocket. I'm going to skip over here's not here. I'm not going to talk about that other than what I've already talked about it, as context for what we're seeing here, but I'm not going into the details of that. I am actually going to skip over 606, even though that's got tons of Beth symbolism in it. I'm just not focusing on that right now. So anyway, that's pretty much what we're seeing here. And we've got a serious reference there. You seriously want to risk that. But they are basically trying to convince Carter to help them do this. Next we see the next 4 or 5 actually are just mostly people getting ready. So they're building the wall, with the plates. They're doing sandbags. We see a lot of interpersonal things going on between the characters. So this is where Daryl says to Rick that he thinks going out and searching for more people is taking care of all of them. And they have a little conversation about that. It's also decided that Carol will stay back in Alexandria while this is going on. She says that Rick is in charge now, even if Deanna is technically in charge. We have Maggie telling Tara what Nicholas did, in that he tried to kill Glenn, and just them having a conversation about it. And this is the only really interesting thing I saw about Maggie, and that is simply that she was being an optimist at this point. She told Tara that she believes things can get better. You know, the whole thing about how she and Tara were enemies on opposite sides of the fence on the worst day of her life, which is when Herschel was killed. And now they're good friends. So she said that Glenn saves people and she believes Nicholas can be saved. And it was just kind of surprising to watch this because I put this together, you know, before Daryl Dixon season 3 started. So it was not too long after we saw Dead City. And, you know, she's definitely not being an optimist, right? In Dead City. But I mean, she really hasn't been since Glenn died. It really hardened her and made her just not that anymore, you know, after she lost Glenn, which is understandable. But Glenn also did soften Maggie. She helped him to be more, or I said that wrong. He helped her to be more optimistic. And after he died, she's been in a really cold, dark place ever since then. And I do think that The Walking Dead is good at doing that with couples. So you guys have heard me say this a million times about how, you know, even aside from shipping, Daryl and Carol would make a terrible couple for the most part because they're both so destructive, you know, given to destructive tendencies when bad things happen. And neither of them are optimists. But Ezekiel is a massive optimist. You know, he's almost a caricature of optimism sometimes. And Beth, you know, she too was an optimist. So they balance out the darker parts of Daryl and Carol's personalities. And if Daryl and Carol were together, they wouldn't have anyone to balance them out. And that just sounds like a murder-suicide pact waiting to happen, right? So we don't want that. So anyway, I just thought that this was an interesting example of that and how Maggie was much more optimistic when Glenn was around. And it's, you know, really sad that he's not around anymore because she has not come really out of her grief and the dark place that put her in. Even years later, she's still very much in that place. We also see Morgan and Carol talking. He sees right through her mask that she's showing to the Alexandrians, you know, the sweet caretaker and all that she was putting on. And you can tell she doesn't like it very much that you can see through that. So yeah, just little things going on here. Rick tells Deanna that he's sorry about Reg. And we have a scene where it's really obvious that Deanna's people don't know how to fight walkers and that they're going to need to be trained. So Rick says people need to be armed inside the walls. And then we have this thing where the walkers come out of the woods. And at first, Rick tells his people not to help. And he's, you know, telling it's like Carter and Tobin. And he's saying, go get them, hit them with your shovel, do something. And they don't know how. So Morgan runs in and helps. And yeah, it's just something where it's obvious that Deanna's people need training. So then we have this next scene, which is kind of comical at the beginning. Eugene hears Carter conspiring to stop the operation and kill Rick. He says, so it's on us. We have to stop him. Plain and simple, we kill him. He's talking to other Alexandrians. I know that Tobin is there and Olivia is there, and they're not really agreeing with Carter. They just don't think this is a good idea. But then Eugene drops stuff and they catch him eavesdropping, and Carter aims a gun at him, right? But then Rick and Daryl and Morgan come in and see what's happening. Rick pretty easily disarms Carter because he's not much of a warrior like Rick's people are. But this is why I included this, and this is why this is interesting. We have a little bit of a replay of Coda here. So first, let's keep in mind that they are thinking about killing Rick. That's what Carter is proposing. They're targeting him because they don't like him. That could be a symbolic replay of Coda. There's been plenty of theories wondering if maybe the bullet that hit Beth was meant for Rick and they were trying to kill Rick. But you know, I think this could be a hint that something along those lines was going on, whether it was in the hallway at Grady or some other time. But more specifically, we have Rick holding a gun to Carter's head and thinking he's going to kill him. And then Daryl reaches out and says, you know, Rick, like basically don't, which is exactly what happens in Coda when they captured Lucari. So if you remember that, Lucari actually attacked Daryl, kind of took him by surprise, and then Rick came back to help Daryl. And he had a gun on Lucari, and he just kind of had this like sinister smile on his face, and you know, Rick being really brutal and everything, and was going to kill him. And Daryl held out his hand exactly the same way as he does here and says, you know, don't. And it's because Daryl wants to use him as part of the prisoner exchange. But it was obvious then in Coda that Rick really wanted to kill Lucari, and he wasn't too happy with Daryl for stopping him. But this time it's different. You know, Daryl reaches out and says, Rick, and Rick immediately puts the gun down and is super mellow about it and says, no, I'm good. He can go. right? So the point here is to see that Rick has changed and he's not as brutal as he was, at least while Coda was happening. So either way, it's a replay. And when we get to the next flashback where he's talking to Morgan on the porch, we're going to actually get a little bit of explanation of this, right? So this is the part I was telling you about before, where he says we don't need to do that anymore, meaning Morgan doesn't need to stay in the brownstone. Let's see. He tells Morgan he can come out of the cell, and Morgan holds baby Judith. And he basically says, you know, you're the same person you were before. You know, I recognize that. And I think we have gotten to know each other well enough, even if it's the first time. So it's a little bit of a play on the title. So same you that's right in front of me right now. Okay. So then we have this kind of interesting conversation where Rick says, and I'm very much paraphrasing here, but he basically says it's easier to kill the stupid people or the fearful people who just shouldn't be alive anymore because they are not strong enough to handle themselves on the outside. So it's just easier to kill them, right? And he's talking about Carter, and he says Carter doesn't get it when it comes to them, and I think he means walkers and the threats on the outside, right? So we have another I get it thing here, you know, except it's the opposite because Carter doesn't get it. And he says, you know, I wanted to kill him, but all of this hit me and I realized I didn't have to do it. So he's saying, you know, on the one hand, he doesn't understand why people like that would rather cocoon themselves in ignorance than face reality. So it's everything I talked about before with the I get it theme. You know, they're going to put themselves in a prison, even if they don't really need to be there because they don't want to face what's outside because they're too afraid. And he also says that somebody like that, meaning somebody like Carter, is going to die no matter what. Like he'll figure out some way to get himself killed, right? But because Rick realizes he doesn't need to be the one to actually mete out their death, right? So it's a reflection of what happened during season 5. I mean, this is something that Rick learned. And, you know, it probably does have to do with guilt he had over everything that went down. I mean, we've talked many times about how if Rick hadn't killed Lamson, they would have had a third person to offer, and then Dawn would not have had any ground to stand on to demand that Noah come with her because she would have gotten 3 officers back instead of 2, and then maybe Beth wouldn't have been shot, right? So this really could be coming from Rick's guilt over that, and you know, that he learned that maybe he shouldn't be so quick to kill people, basically. And, you know, if they are going to die, they're going to die. But he doesn't need to be the one to kill them. So just kind of interesting. And that's kind of how they're showing us that Rick has changed. But once again, we are calling back to things that happened in season 5. So that's, he doesn't get it, meaning Carter, they're going to die no matter what. We have a little flashback. I don't have much to say about this. It's just Rick wanting Jesse to learn how to use a gun, and she is, and they talk about Ron a little bit. So then this is him explaining what's going to go down during Operation Lead the Walkers Away, and it's meant to happen the following day. So they're doing a dry run, just walking through and him showing where everything is and where it's going to be, explaining the different stations, but they're planning to just walk through this, go home, and they're going to do this the next day. Fortunately, it doesn't work out that way, right? So he says, when we make it to green, we fall back. So what they're planning to do is lead the walkers, and I'll get to this in a minute, the 3 stations. Once they get to the green balloons, that's kind of the end of the line for most of them. Only Sasha and Abraham and Daryl will take them 20 miles more at that point. So he's just explaining that. And then we have this conversation between Sasha and Abraham. This is right before they start the operation. They talk, and he says, "Are you doing this because you want to die?" And she smiles and says no. And for a long time, I wasn't sure really what to make of that, but I'm pretty sure she's lying here, like this huge smile. It shows that she's not telling the truth, right? And actually, we see Michonne do this later, and I think it's meant to be a little bit of a parallel. So the smile shows that Abraham's onto something, right? He's seeing truth. And we know that Sasha was in a very dark place during this part of the series because she had just lost both Bob, her boyfriend, and Tyrese, right? So she's not in a very pleasant place emotionally. It's also pretty clear that Abraham doesn't believe her. But this is just kind of leading up to, what happens when they're in the car together during, and eventually it's going to lead to Always Accountable, which is where we kind of get the beginning of their romance. So this is mostly a setup thing. Okay, so this part is important to understand, not so much in terms of the symbolism, maybe a little bit, but in terms of the logistics of what's going on. So along the path that they are going to have the walkers take, so this is actually after Marshall and Redding, so after they do the turn, the walkers are going to come right past here. And this is a tractor store, but there are walkers, people who have died inside the store, who are banging on the windows. Now, those walkers can't get out on their own, but they're worried that the noise those walkers are making from inside the building is going to distract the herd and pull them off the road. Because we know that walkers move toward noise, right? So what Rick says here is that they need to take care of this. He says, we'll clear it on our way back tonight. So once again, they're going through this dry run, and then they're going to head back to Alexandria, and Rick is saying on their way back, they will kill all these walkers, take them down so that they don't have to worry about that the next day when they're going through and doing this. Once again, it does not work out that way. So the super ironic thing is he says, we don't want any surprises tomorrow. You have to laugh at that because, yeah, clearly they just get surprise after surprise after surprise. And then okay, so we get this part where Nicholas wants to help, and he tells Glenn, I want to help you out tomorrow. And Glenn actually tells him, no, you're not going to do that. He says, look, you're doing really well. And if you continue to do well, then I will train you so that you know how to be out here and can take care of yourself, but you're not there yet. And Nicholas accepts that and says, thank you. But again, because it doesn't wait until tomorrow and it's all very sudden, obviously Nicholas does end up being a part of it. So then we get to the speech where he says, I know this sounds insane, but this is an insane world. And this is the end of the flashbacks. But remember that we are going chronologically here. So from there, we have to come for them before they come for us. And now we are in the present, which is where the operation begins. So again, they were not going to do this until tomorrow, but this semi truck up here falls down and the walkers get out. So he says, we have to do this now. We're doing this now. And of course, that's hard because they weren't entirely ready. No one was expecting to do it right now. And immediately everybody's stressed out, right? So everybody basically scatters to their various jobs, right? Sasha, Abraham, and Daryl will lead the walkers. Daryl on his bike, Sasha and Abraham in the car. We have Rick and Morgan and Michonne, which are going to where the turn happens because they're going to light off flare guns. Rick tells Glenn and Heath and Nicholas to go clear out that tractor shop so that when the walkers get there, they're not, the noise does not distract them and pull them off the road. So they're all doing their own things, right? Now, this sign right here is really important. I remember seeing this when this first aired, and we did pounce on it. We were like, something about that is telling us to go back to season 5, right? But it was hard to interpret. Like, is this just a random Beth reference? And you guys, this is why I always look at frameworks. This is why I always look at templates, because they're not just going to throw a number 5 in there just to be like, season 5, yay! And it doesn't mean anything. No, that's not really what Gimple does. Okay, I know it seems that way sometimes because we don't know what the interpretation is, but he actually works with full templated storylines, right? So this is telling us something about season 5, and I will get to what it means, but it's really not just a random season 5 reference. It is showing us that in a lot of ways, this is a replay of what happened during season 5, and I will get to that in more detail as we go along. So this is important, especially because this is shown at the beginning of the episode. So season 6 begins, beginning of episode 1, we see this, and it's telling us that the story we're looking at is in some way relevant to season 5, okay? So we have Daryl on his bike, the walker's coming up behind him. This is Sasha and Abraham in the car. He says, are you good? And she says, I'm trying. This is a theme that we hear a lot, and we heard Daryl and Carol say it in Consumed, so that's season 5 as well. So then, I thought I took a picture of this dialogue, but I can't find it now, so maybe it got lost. But Then Abraham says, if you're still fixing to go buck wild with the breath impaired, and you just have to love the way Abraham talks. You can never figure out quite what he's saying, even though he's speaking English. So I literally had to Google this to figure out what he was talking about. And breath impaired, he's just suggesting a breathalyzer text. So he's suggesting alcohol. And I actually found a Reddit thread where people were talking about what this meant, and people were asking if he was implying that Sasha was drunk, but the consensus seems to be that he's talking about himself, because this whole time, remember I showed you that flashback picture where he was putting the ring on top of the whiskey? He had this whiskey with him, and he's constantly drinking from it. So he's talking about himself, that he's always drunk. And I mean, he's like Mad Eye Moody with his flask or something. He's just always like taking a swig, you know? So he's saying, you know, like he had asked her before, like if she was doing this because she wanted to die, he's thinking that she's going to do something crazy. And what he's telling her is that he's drunk and he's not going to be able to, you know, maybe help her as much or protect her as much because he's kind of drunk. So once again, he says, if you're still fixing to go buck wild, meaning do something suicidal, with the breath impaired, meaning his breath is impaired because he's drunk, right? And then she says, if you were so worried, why did you get in the car with me? He doesn't really answer her. And then she says, listen, doing something this big, that's living. Now, obviously, that's a Beth theme as well. We heard her say that at Grady. You know, you call this living versus surviving. And I remember going over this when it was first on. I found a lot of things. You can read my own old theories about this. It's when I first realized that Sasha and Abraham were a Bethel proxy. And the thing is, I figured that out, that they were a proxy, before I realized they were going to be a romantic couple. We didn't really understand that they were going to be a romantic couple until 606, right? Which is always accountable. So I wasn't even thinking that they were a romantic couple. I was just thinking they're being used as proxies, even if they're just friends, right? And then sure enough, 606, it's like, oh, okay, so they are going to be a romantic couple. But I still wasn't entirely sure what Sasha meant by this. I think now that she meant that they are taking control of the situation. So remember before I said that in the meeting where they were explaining to the Alexandrians what they were going to do, they just put a lot of emphasis on Rick being very confident that the walkers could be controlled and they could be herded in a way, right? And this is kind of similar. She's saying, doing something as big as this, that's living. And so what I think she's saying is that, you know, if they were surviving, then they're just reacting. They're just waiting until the walkers are at their doorstep to actually do anything about it. But this is not that. They are planning ahead, right? They are taking control of this. What Rick said, they're going to come for the walkers before the walkers come for them. So they're going to lead the walkers away to keep their people safe. So they're not just surviving and hoping the walkers don't come. They're actually attempting to manipulate an entire horde, thousands upon thousands of walkers. And if they can do that to keep their people safe, then they're no longer in survival mode. It's a very well thought out and well planned operation, right? And that's living. That's what she's saying. So then we get to the three stations. We gotta they get to where the red balloons are, and this is station 1. These are obviously very symbolic. I'll go over that later, but we've got red, yellow, and green balloons for stations 1, 2, and 3. The red balloons are where they begin. This is where Sasha and Abraham in the red car will join Daryl, and the real operation begins. So Daryl's already going slow on his bike, like we saw, and the walkers are coming up behind them, but Sasha and Abraham are going to wait here. And, you know, once the walkers get there, then they will start slowly leading them in the direction they want them to go. Obviously, there was a stretch of land where the walkers were coming from the quarry to the red balloons, and this is where everybody kind of jumps into action. So not only will you have Sasha, Abraham, and Daryl leading them away, but there's going to be people, teams on both sides of the road in the woods to pick off the stragglers that might separate from the herd, or to keep them on the straight and narrow, as it were, on the road and going in the direction they want them to, right? Abraham calls that getting sloppy, when some of the walkers move off the road and they have to either kill them or push them back onto the road somehow. Okay, then we have the second station, which is the yellow balloons, and this is where the turn happens, okay? And this is really important for to understand that this is going on, and it's also very highly symbolic, okay? So it's where they reach the intersection of Reading and Marshall, where Eugene was showing them on the map, and they take the herd into a hard right turn to get them away from Alexandria. And I will show you that as they come up on that place. The green balloons, which I don't actually have a picture of here, is the final station, the third step, you know, and that's where the teams don't need to be there anymore, as Rick was explaining. The only people who will still be working is Sasha, Abraham, and Daryl, because from the point where they hit the green balloons, they're going to lead the herd another 20 miles out before they circle back and go home. So the idea is that they'll be 20 miles out and headed in a different direction. So at that point, Alexandria will be pretty safe. At the green balloons, I think it's just understood that it's far enough away that they don't need the people on both sides of the road anymore, because if it's, you know, it doesn't really say how far away the green balloons are from Alexandria, but at that point, if a few stragglers, you know, get sloppy and go off the road, it's not a big deal. So that the green is supposed to be kind of an end of the operation for everyone except Sasha, Abraham, and Daryl, who will go farther. All right. Now we see the scene with Rick and Michonne and Morgan, and we have this interesting little conversation, right? I hadn't thought about this in a long time, right? He asks if she ate one of his peanut butter protein bars. And she says, no. And she's very smug about it. And he says, see, I could have sworn there was one more peanut butter left. Now, what does peanut butter represent? You guys know this. Peanut butter is a Beth symbol, right? And then Michonne says, sighing, that's how it is, isn't it? You always think there's going to be one more peanut butter left. Now, this is really interesting because I remember people complaining when this was first on that this was a little bit of a discontinuity. Because while we did see her eat some of Morgan's food in Clear, Rick even got after her for it and said, oh, we're eating his food now, you know? She was clearly not eating a protein bar. She was eating some sort of chips or crackers. She was crunching them. And, you know, this is one of those things where maybe the writers could have simply changed it a little bit. Little mishaps like this happen all the time in TV writing, but I don't think that's what's going on here. We also know that The Walking Dead and Gimple are very, very careful about things like this. And I do not believe they would have changed it unless they were doing it on purpose. The key here is obviously peanut butter, okay? It was a peanut butter protein bar that he was asking her if she ate. And she immediately smiles and says no. Now, this is what I was talking about when I said, I think she's meant to be lying here. Like she smiles and goes, no. And that's exactly what Sasha does when she's talking to Abraham. So I think we're supposed to understand that smug little grin means that they're lying, right? Then Morgan says, you know, I could have sworn there was another peanut butter bar there. And Michonne, you know, again, that's just how it goes. You always think there's going to be another peanut butter left. Now, obviously, we know that peanut butter equals Beth because Daryl equals jam. They are peanut butter and jelly together. So what are they trying to say here? On the surface, I was kind of trying to deconstruct what Michonne's answer is. And it almost seems like she's saying that there isn't one. Like there's no peanut butter left. You just think there is, you know? So Morgan thought there was one, but there really wasn't. But I think the idea here is that there was one and she ate it. So even though it's discontinuous, I think that's what they're going for. So from Morgan's point of view, he was sure there was another peanut butter bar, but when he went to look for it, it was gone. And he didn't know where it went, which is exactly what happens with Beth, right? They went to look for her. We believe she was left in a car. And when they went back for her, she was gone. They didn't know where she went. So I feel like this is a callback to that during the missing 17 days. It's also important that it happens right at the turn. And I will explain why when I come back to that. But I think it could also be a hint for the future, almost like she's saying there could be another peanut butter bar out there somewhere, right? And maybe it might come back around. And obviously that doesn't make sense in terms of an actual peanut butter protein bar, right? Michonne's not going to regurgitate a peanut butter bar she ate 2 years ago, but they're being very on the nose with this peanut butter symbolism, especially the fact that it's here at the turn and the yellow balloons. Beth wore yellow. We'll just throw that in there. But I will come back to why the turn is so important, okay? So then after this, we actually see the turn. Well, first we see, this is still the red. So this is the red car that Abraham and Sasha are in, pulling out so that they're with Daryl now. And the Walker horde is obviously coming up behind them. But very quickly, we see them get to the turn. So this is where they're going to turn. They have created a, you know, circular, semicircular wall here that will push the walkers into a right turn. This is the part with Glenn, and we see that he and Heath are trying to figure out what to do. They need to kill the walkers in the tractor store, right? They have to get the walkers out of there because there's enough walkers in the tractor shop that the noise from them will pull the herd off the road, and they don't want that. We do still have a lot of drama going on with Glenn and Nicholas at this point. Nicholas keeps wanting to help, but Glenn keeps pushing him away. And he says Nicholas has to do everything he says if he wants to help, but he's not actually letting him kill the walkers. He's saying, you know, you're not ready for that. Me and Heath will kill them. So they're going to open this door, you know, and like let the walkers out so they can kill them. But they do this interesting countdown thing. Okay, so first we see Rick, and I didn't actually capture it, but he's got the orange flare gun here. So we see him by himself with the flare gun, and Glenn says 1. Then we see Sasha and Abraham here, and you can kind of see Daryl in the background, and he says 2. And then we see Daryl kind of riding by himself. We don't actually see the red car in this shot. And then we see this blonde walker, right? And he says 3. I think obviously that is all symbolic. Now, let's just say that when they get to 3 and they open the door here, there's actually a metal plate there, so the walkers cannot get out that way, right? So that doesn't go so well. But what does this 1, 2, 3 mean? Remember that I said that Rick is a Beth proxy, right? And Sasha and Abraham are Bethel proxies together. So it's almost like seeing Rick alone is like seeing Beth alone, right? So first it's him by himself, and again that flare gun, which we've seen the flare gun entangled with other Beth symbolism, and it is a fire symbol, right? So it's almost like this represents Beth by herself. And then we see both Daryl and these two, which represent a Bethel proxy, and so it's like seeing Beth and Daryl together. And then we see him by himself on his bike. And then we see this blonde walker. Now, I don't know if all of you remember this, but when this, in the first, especially few seasons after Coda, the blonde walkers were a big deal, okay? The blonde walkers, at least the female ones that they're really focusing on, they almost always are a proxy for Beth. And a lot of that comes from the end of season 5, when in Try, when Daryl and Aaron find that walker tied to the tree, and it's so obvious that it makes Daryl think of Beth, right? So we kind of know that the blonde walkers are proxies of her, and I think they've used this less as they've gotten further away from season 5. But this was a big one. I mean, this blonde walker, I've got some other pictures of her that are a little bit better, but even what she's wearing is somewhat reminiscent of Beth, and she is leading the horde. So she's like directly behind Daryl on his bike. And I do think that that's important, which I can get into later. There's just something about Beth leading a horde of walkers, and we see the symbolism over and over again. But anyway, the point is, so it's like, what I'm feeling like they're trying to say here is, first we see, like I said, we see Rick by himself, so that's Beth by herself, and then we see, you know, a representation of Beth and Daryl together through Abraham and Sasha, and that really could be pointing to them together in season 4 when they were on the road. And then we see them kind of separate, right? We see Daryl by himself and then this blonde walker, which may represent Beth. And that's kind of where they're at in season 6 here, is they've been separated, right? So they're kind of symbolically trying to point to something, let's put it that way. And when this first aired, I really zeroed in on this 1, 2, 3 because it feels so intentional to me. Okay, so maybe I'm not entirely interpreting it right, but I do think they're trying to tell us something there. So once again, they have this plate here, and that's not going well with them getting the walkers out of the tractor shop. And again, they have to do that before the horde reaches this tractor shop. But this is where we see them come into the turn. We get lots of shots of this, that's going to be semicircular. It's at the yellow balloons. Rick and Michonne and Morgan are going to use the flare guns and shoot them off to keep the horde coming toward them. So we see them approaching the turn here. Sasha and Abraham in the car, Daryl on his bike. We see the Marshall and Redding sign, quite obviously, they focus on it. So it's important to know that Marshall is going straight. So they put up these plates, right? So that the horde cannot continue on Marshall, but if those plates weren't there, then they would continue straight, and that would lead them straight back to Alexandria. Redding is the hard right turn, so they're trying to get them to come this way so that they are moving parallel to Alexandria and away from it, right? So they do put a lot of emphasis on this, and the fact is, it actually works, right? They're all really worried that it's not going to work, and the wall's going to fall down, and the walkers will continue toward Alexandria, but overall, it goes off without a hitch, and the walkers do turn, right? So then they're heading that way, and things are going really well. They are now heading down Redding and in a different direction. But we still have this problem of the tractor shop. So Once again, Glenn tells Nicholas not to help. It's going to be him and Heath. But when they shoot out the glass, there's a lot more walkers in there than they thought. I don't remember what the number is, but Glenn does say a number at one point. I think he says there's like 7 of them in there, and actually there's more like 15 to 20. So they just keep coming out, and they were a little bit unprepared for how many there were. But it all goes pretty well. Nicholas does jump in and help at one point. And I do notice that the last walker that comes out and needs to be killed is a blonde woman in a jean jacket here. So she's a little bit reminiscent of Beth. But for right now, I'll just say that this feels very similar to when the walkers broke the glass at the school in Coda and then went toward Father Gabriel's church. They were chasing him. So I think there's something of a replay here. And also, it's just very thematic, right? But they are emphasizing here a lot that they don't want the horde to get distracted. They don't want any noise pulling the herd off the road. And that's going to end up being important because that's exactly what happens when the wolf's horn goes off, right? At the end of the episode. So they're setting up for that. But more than that, we've just established over and over again that noise and sound is one thing that the walkers often respond to. Yes, also lights to some extent and movement, but sound is a big one. So there's a lot of emphasis on that throughout this arc, and that's intentional. But Glenn has finally been successful, with Heath and Nicholas's help, and has taken out the walkers at the tractor stores, so they're no longer a threat. So then we move on to the next thing, and that is Sasha and Abraham again. And here we have some looky-loos, as Abraham calls them, who are getting sloppy. They are breaking off and going into the woods. So what he decides to do is jump out of the car and get them back on track. Basically, he's using himself as bait. And Sasha isn't happy about this and calls him an idiot, which is funny, especially considering that they're about to embark on a romance. So he jumps out and she says idiot. And when he jumps back in, he's got blood all over him, right? I'm sure he killed 1 or 2 of them. That's where the blood came from. But when he does, Sasha scowls at him. And it's interesting because he was accusing her of doing something stupid, but he's really the one that did something stupid by jumping out of the car like that. But also remember, he's kind of drunk. So there is that. But then he talks to her about how he's a little bit messed up, about how Rick shot Pete right when Abraham was cheek to cheek with him. And he's really not one to complain to Rick about that, but it really did give Abraham a little bit of PTSD, which I think it would anybody. So this is just a conversation between them. And again, we're setting up for their romance and for Always Accountable. All right, so then we see that we've got the 2 groups on either side of the road, right? So we've got Rick, Michonne, Morgan, and Carter on one side. On the other side, I think the only one we know for sure the only person whose name we know is Tobin, but there are the other Alexandrians. Annie is the one who ends up getting killed in episode 3, and Scott is probably over there, who is Sasha's husband in real life. But anyway, the only one that Rick really says is Tobin. So we have Carter conceding that Rick was right and think, it seems to be working, which is true. And then Rick sends him off on some little errand, and unfortunately he gets bitten by a walker. And this is the walkers, because he's over here in the forest, he's yelling. The walkers are turning off the road toward him, right? And that is a problem. So Rick is forced to kill him, which he would have died anyway because he was not bitten in a place that they could cut off a limb. So either way, he would have died, unfortunately. So we hear Rick radio the other team and tell Tobin to fire off their guns. So the herd gets back on the road after coming slightly off of it. And then he sends Morgan back to Alexandria. So it's kind of a sad moment. Everybody's pretty depressed that Carter gets killed, even though he was definitely the one causing the most trouble. He'd come around and it was just sad, right? But Rick sends Morgan back to Alexandria to tell them what's happening. So it's important to remember that this operation was not meant to go down today. So Carol and Carl and everybody who's back at Alexandria doesn't even know that they're actually doing this. They just think they're on a dry run. So he says, Morgan, go back to Alexandria and tell them what's going on. They've got an hour before the herd reaches green, at which time, of course, they're going to hand them off to Daryl, Sasha, and Abraham. So these are the walkers going back onto the road because Tobin's people are firing off their guns. So that works to get them back on. And this is when he's saying we've got an hour until we hit green. then the horn goes off, right? And we know, because we've seen the episodes now, that this is the wolf's horn, but at the time we didn't know what this was. It was just this crazy thing that happened. It's a horn or something. It's pulling the back half off the road. And she says, whatever it is that's far, it sounds like it's coming from home. And then we just actually see the walkers leaving the road. So we have the sign, Alexandria that way, in case there was any doubt. And as you can see, the front part of the horde keeps going. So it's like they're far enough away that the horn doesn't get their attention, but the back half is heading this way, which is straight toward Alexandria. So that's pretty much the end of the first episode. Okay, guys, I'm going to end this video here. I know it's more than an hour long. It's not going to take us this much time to get through the rest of the episodes. Like I said at the beginning, I'll be much more piecemeal about the rest of the episodes. This first episode was just really important to really set up what's going on. So in the next one, I will probably get through the rest of the episodes for the whole arc, and then I will go into what it means and why I'm telling you all of this. So please bear with me. I promise it'll be good. Be worth it. All right, see you in the next video.